So I'm just going to close my window because someone decided to start weed whacking. All right, so I hope you are all doing well, had a good weekend. So this week, on Wednesday, it's Canada Day, so we won't have a class. That's a-okay. This course was sort of planned with the 2 days we have off due to stat holidays in mind, so we're not going to fall behind or anything. But what I want to go over before we start the lesson proper is assignment 2. So in the Dropbox folder, in the syllabus assignments folder, you'll see that there's now an assignment 2 PDF. So assignment 2 is discussed in the syllabus, is a massing model. So what do I need to do? Part 1, Rhino massing model. So please hand in a Rhino, that should say mass model, that incorporates the following techniques. So site coverage / footprint calculation, as discussed last class. A maximum shadowing envelope derived from the techniques covered last class and then this class. So we sort of started talking about solar envelope / shading envelopes last class. As well as a developed lot developed from the landscaping techniques covered this class. And then also sort of the area division / area of subtraction as per the techniques covered July 6th. So I broke it down this way just so you can go through the videos and just make sure that you're including all the topics. But I think it'll be kind of self-evident as we go through the classes that I'll be guiding you through a process to, as Hugh Ferris did here back in the almost 100 years ago now. You start from a kind of very abstract, low resolution massing envelope, and as we proceed in steps, you start adding more and more definition to this envelope based on bylaws. So the model needs to be developed on a lot of your choice from the island of Ananav. So please keep your lot in the same location as the Rhino file. So what I mean by that is, let's say your lot is 35 right here. You don't have to, include the entire island when you submit your file. In fact, it would probably just be better if your file were built up on, just this lot, as well as the one lot that you're sort of referencing, maybe some of this elevated freeway. But, if you hand in your file with these objects plus your massing, that would be preferred. The only thing that I would ask is that you do not move this lot, elsewhere in the Rhino world space. And the reason for that is that I'm going to compile everyone's projects so we can populate this overall site. So if you haven't chosen a lot for your project, you can click on this link right here. And most of you have, but just as a refresher, if you click on that link, essentially what you're going to get is this list here, each number corresponding to a lot on the island. So for the most part, people have signed up. There's still some spaces left. We won't fill up all these spaces. In fact, I've taken over yet another space for this class. And I might invite some people from sort of other firms or perhaps other profs to submit a site, but we'll see how that goes. Eventually all the lots will be filled, but for this you can just choose one site. So your massing needs to meet these Ananav bylaws, and these are the ones we discussed last class. They're also in the file. So the site file is a quick refresher. I did actually change its location, so it's under the syllabus assignments folder, and it's in the island model and lots link. So there's a Rhino 5 and a Rhino 6. So this is the file I'm referring to. So these notes are also in this file. But the rules that you need to follow are a max surface coverage of 40%, max FSR of 10, min FSR of 6, max height of 250 meters or 820 feet, and your building cannot shade one north block of your choice between March 20th to September 22nd between noon and 4 p.m. And if there's no block to the north of your site, you can choose a shoreline instead. The shadow envelope derived from your choice of north block must have an actual effect on your massing envelope. So we'll sort of go through what those mean in this class, sort of review. But if you have any question about what this actually means, feel free to reach out. And your building mass must stay at least 2 meters away from elevated freeways. So elevated freeways being these sort of twisty-turny roads that are going all over the island. So this model does not need to be rendered. And in addition to these requirements, refer back to the syllabus for my sort of general marking rubric. And I'll be marking for Rhino file layer organization, and I'll assign extra marks for mass modeling that goes above and beyond the requirements laid out here. So if you really, really want to, develop something which is quite complex and, you really take on the project, I will assign extra marks. So part 2, again, because at this part of the course we're more or less demonstrating techniques in Grasshopper that do very specific things, I'm not really expecting that you all go out and sort of develop your own algorithms in Grasshopper. So to that end, I think that it doesn't matter so much that I comb through all of your Grasshopper files to make sure that you've copied exactly what we've done in class, because that's easy enough to do, and the main outcome of that is learning. However, like assignment 1, I'd like you to choose one of your Grasshopper files and show off your organization skills. And if you do want to do something that is sort of self-directed, as it were, that expands on the material of the course, that falls under the same kind of note as extra work can get extra marks. So feel free to do extra if you want, but definitely not required. So you should be turning in one Rhino file and one Grasshopper file, and you, just like assignment 1, there's a Dropbox link here. So this is a different Dropbox link. Your files are due Monday, July 13th at midnight. And please hand in your files with your first name or last name, comma, first name, underscore assignment. That should say 2. So I'll fix the 2 typos I found in here. And please do not zip your files together. Hand them in as 2 separate files. So does anyone have any questions before we start the lecture proper? All right. So, as I mentioned, just so we're all totally clear, I have changed some things in the Dropbox folder. So, under syllabus and assignments, I have put the model, the site model itself, as well as the links to the lots in its own folder. I just did that for organizational reasons, as well as I've updated the syllabus, and I've put the old version in the superseded folder here. So updating the syllabus is not something that it's something that usually happens, but the 2 things I did update, so I added Nicholas to the syllabus, and then the other small change that I did make was in the original syllabus I had put that there was a little bit of wiggle room, as it were. So I said, we'll play catch up here, or do some extra topics on Monday, July 6th, if need be. But because we know how the schedule is going for sure now, we know that, for instance, today we're going to be doing the second part of the solar envelope, and then we'll be jumping into some site development. So that's all I've done is I've just updated this schedule page here, and I don't see anything else changing after this. So what we're going to do is we're going to carry on from last class, and as you may have noticed, there is a new lot here, so I'm really leaning into that Animal Crossing theme, I guess. So again, I've never played the game, but I know this is Tom Nook, who, as I understand it, is a capitalist fat cat, sort of predatory debtor in the world of Animal Crossing. So this is a monument to him. So we're going to be working on this site for the second part of this lesson, essentially when we're doing some landscaping type things. So if you haven't done so yet, please download the plugin Bison. That's in the syllabus. The link for it's in the syllabus. But what we're going to do first is we're going to kind of pick up where we left off with dealing with some solar/shadow envelopes and using those to derive a shading envelope like we have right here. So let's open Grasshopper, and we should have a file that's sort of at the midpoint right now. So a work in progress from last class. There we are. So just open the file which you had saved last class. Let's see. So this was my file right here. So I believe, and maybe I'll save this in the Dropbox just so we're all on the same page, and then I'll quickly review what we've done, and it'd be great if I could get a confirmation of sort of letting me know that that was indeed where we ended up last class. So I'll save this folder or this document to the Dropbox just in case you didn't save your file from last class, so we can all be on the same page. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to again work on this this demo site here. So this green layer right here, you can either work on your lot or you can choose to work along with me on this lot. And essentially what we had done last class is we had sort of explored what this sort of set of components that I've developed does. So we discussed how this set of components, it will give you the essentially altitude and azimuth, or the solar vector, on a given day or a range of days. So for example, right now the component is set to the year 2020. It's set to September 22nd on both the start date and the end date, so that's the fall equinox. It is set to noon until 4 p.m., so a 24-hour clock, and essentially it is doing an analysis every hour. So you can see here that the output is the analysis days is 2020, 09, 22, and the sample times are noon, 1 p.m., 2 p.m., 3 p.m., 4 p.m. From there, what it's doing is it's taking this analysis period output, plugging it into another component, which essentially takes these time variables essentially and combines them with the latitude and longitude of Vancouver in this case. in the time zone, so -7, which stands for the Pacific time with daylight savings. And from there, we essentially are able to get the altitude and azimuth. So we can see right here, these lines represent the position of the sun, or the angle of the sun from this sort of point right here. And these are, in Grasshopper, represented by a vector. From these vectors, essentially what we're doing is we're taking a curb. So in this case, the curb is the lot that's directly north from my demo lot. And we're essentially drawing these solar planes. The idea with that being that if this is the curb, so this curb right here, the idea is that if we draw a plane that represents, let's say, the 3 p.m. shadow and the 2 p.m. shadow, we know that if we develop a building that falls underneath this 3 p.m. plane, this 2 p.m. plane, that this building will not shade the curb at those times. So that's where we ended up. And that's where I'm going to pick off. So does that make sense? Is that where we left off last time? Okay, so good, that's great. So if everyone's on track, again, I saved this in Dropbox. So your file, if it's slightly different than mine, you can work from this one. But so essentially what we're doing now is we are going to essentially take our footprint that we've developed. So if you don't have a footprint, I have this footprint underneath the site in the site file. So you can see I have this like weird kind of drawn thing here, and what we're going to do is we're going to extrude it up to these planes right here. Just sort of putting my notes down here. Okay. So first what we want to do is we want to define all the planes we'll be working with. So again, if we look at this rule, cannot shade one north block of your choice between March 20th and September 22nd between noon and 4 p.m. So in this case, I have chosen this curve as my block that I don't want to shade. So that's why we're extruding from there. And right now in Grasshopper, I'm analyzing September 22nd. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a new layer in Rhino. So new layer, and I will call this September 22nd, and I will just call it noon till 4 p.m. Envelopes. So kind of a long name, but it's descriptive. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to bake these extrusions. So my curve envelopes or curve extrusions, planes, whatever you want to call them. I will right-click this component, and I will go to, I'll bake on the September 22nd noon till 4 p.m. envelopes. Click OK. And now these meshes are baked. Now again, one thing you want to make sure of is that these extrusions fully cover your site in plan. So in this case they do, so that's good. The next thing we want to do is, since again we want to analyze the period between September 22nd and March 20th, now March 20th, September 22nd, all the times between them will be a better case scenario than these cases. Because if you think about it, March is the spring equinox, so the beginning of spring. September 22nd is the fall equinox, so the beginning of fall. And between spring and fall is summer, in summer the sky or the sun is higher in the sky, so the shadows are shorter. So we know that any date between these two dates, the shadows will not be the controlling shadows. That being said, we're not really sure if March or September are going to give us more controlling shadows. So why don't we switch our analysis period to March? Before we do that, though, we want to right-click and go Lock Solver. And the reason why we do that is if we were to, let's say, at the beginning here in this calendar, if we were to switch over our month to, let's say, March, and then again, March 20th, all of a sudden this would give us, hundreds of analysis periods because we'd be analyzing between March and September. So we want to change both of these dates to be March 20th. So I'll switch both to March 20th. And once both dates are set to March 20th, make sure it's the same year, then I can right click on the canvas and go unlock solver, but it's the same button. For instance, just to demonstrate, if we were to say March 20th till, I don't know, the 21st, now you can see that as 2 dates, but if you look at the amount of extrusions, they've doubled. And if we said from March 20th to the 31st, you can see all of a sudden all these planes are starting to, really multiply. So that's why I say it's best to lock the solver before making a change to these variables. So now in Rhino, let's make a new layer. We'll call it March 20th, and then noon till 4 p.m. envelopes. And now the output right here, we can bake it to that layer we just made. So I'll right click the extrude component, click bake, and I'll bake it on the March 20th noon till 4 p.m. layer. Okay. And now what I'll do is I'll just select all of these components right here, and I will disable them. It just so I don't accidentally, change something there, because like I said, this component can take a very long time to solve. So if we look at what we have in Rhino, you can see that we have these envelopes, and in our case, again, I realized that if we were to, let's say, do an analysis every 1 minute, it would sort of create this smooth single surface across here. But for the sake of this class, I think this kind of scalloped top is much more interesting. So feel free to kind of play around with your shadow times to get more interesting shapes. You can learn sort of the analysis procedure, but then manipulate it. So you can see that in this case, I'll say that both the September and the March 20th shadow envelopes affect my site. So if it was very clear that only one affected your site, you could feel free to just delete the one that didn't affect your site, but I'll leave both of them on. Now I'll go back into Grasshopper. Now, from the last class, we looked at several different methods to offset and scale and sort of slice our initial footprint in order to get the proper site coverage percentage. So I have this, random shape underneath the site, but maybe what I'll do right now is I will, turn off my solar envelopes, and I'll just draw a new curve on this site. But this curve that I'm drawing right now will come from your offset curve from like the last class. So it needs to be a 40% site coverage or less. Okay, so I have my curve here. You can go transform project. Again, you can use the curve that's in the file, or you can use your own. But this is the curve I'm working with, and it's just below my site right there. Now, what I'm going to do is I am going to select this curve, and then right now what I'm going to do is I'm going to just isolate it. So I'm going to type isolate, just so we can kind of observe this curve in the isolation. So below our, or to the right of our solar analysis here, let's go to params geometry curve. So we're going to reference this curve. So to reference it, we can just select it. I can right click the curve parameter, go set one curve, and I will call this building footprint. And then now you can see it's selected because it's turning green. So what we're going to do is we are going to take this curve, which, you know, looks something like this. We are going to generate a list of points across it that are the vertices of a mesh. So essentially we're going to take this curve and turn it into a planar mesh. Each of those vertices, we're going to shoot a line straight up from each vertice, and we're going to look for an intersection with the lowest possible solar envelope. So we have our sort of scalloped solar envelopes there extruding from the curve. Once that's done, we will get these intersection points like that, like that, like that, all over, and we will tell Grasshopper, rebuild this mesh, and I'll go into this in detail, of course, but build it from the vertices that are the intersection points. So essentially what it's going to do is it's going to take this shape and plan, but it's going to raise it up, you know, to this height. What we're also going to say is if there is a point where it doesn't intersect, then raise that point up to the maximum height of, I think it was, what was our maximum height? It's like, it is 250 meters or 800 feet. So if it doesn't intersect, raise it up to 250 meters. So that's sort of the overall algorithm we're going to work with here. So the first thing we need to do is we need to take this curve and turn it into a surface. So we have our building footprint. Let's go to surface, freeform, and then boundary surfaces. Take our building footprint, put into the edges input of the boundary surfaces component, and you see this gives us one trimmed surface. So this is a planar surface right here. We are going to convert this surface to a mesh. So to do that, simply we can go to Mesh, Utilities, and then Mesh BREP. So Mesh BREP has two inputs. The first one is BREP geometry. So this isn't a BREP, but it is a surface, so it can go into the BREP input. The reason why we don't use the mesh surface is because mesh surface is going to generate a mesh which essentially won't cover the surface perfectly, right? So it's going to be based on a grid of points. So that's why we use mesh BREP. So the surfaces, let's plug into the BREP. You can see that our mesh is now kind of perfectly fit to this surface, despite it being very, you know, angled and whatnot. And essentially we're going to use this mesh moving forward. Now, I mentioned that what's going to be very important is the mesh vertices. So in the chat, could anyone raise their hand or type a comment if they're uncertain of like what a mesh is and what I'm referring to when I say a mesh vertice? Okay, so I'll very quickly go over it then with just a quick image. So essentially, just in case for those who maybe need a quick refresher, a mesh is just a type of three-dimensional digital geometry which is made up of faces. The faces are defined by vertices or a single vertex. So in this case, we have a mesh, sphere made out of quad faces. So quads is in 4 vertices, and you can see the vertices shared by these faces. So on our mesh, we need to make sure that we have a certain density of vertices in order to get an accurate sampling of our solar extrusions above. So to sort of get a sense of how dense we are in terms of vertices, let's go to Mesh, Analysis, and then go to Mesh Edges. And let's take our mesh brep component, take the output mesh, and plug it into the mesh input. And now we can sort of see the topology of this mesh. Now, if I turn on my envelopes, so my solar envelopes, just so I can think this through, if what we're going to do is we're going to take the vertices in this mesh, which are all the points which define the faces of a mesh, that means that we have a vertice right here, 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 right here. If we extrude those, how many vertices do we have? If we take those 10 vertices, so it's a very low resolution mesh, and just extrude them straight up and look for intersection points and then remake this mesh, we're not going to really get an accurate representation of how this mesh can define a solar envelope or a shading envelope. So what we want to do is we want to take this mesh and add more vertices to it, so to increase the resolution of its face right here. So to do that, in our mesh brep component, we have another input called settings. And what we are going to do is we are going to go into mesh, utilities, and then go into settings custom. So mesh, utilities, settings custom. And we are going to hook our settings custom component into the input of our settings in the mesh brep. So you can see right off the bat, it's added more vertices to this mesh, so it's sort of given it a higher density. Now, at this point, we haven't touched anything here, and we say, oh, maybe this is good enough for what we want, but I actually want to increase the density quite a bit. So what I'm going to say is we should mostly look at the min edge and the max edge. So what the edges refer to are the edges of the faces in the mesh. So if we're working with meters right now, you can see, I don't know, this edge here is, let's say 43 meters. This edge here is 20 meters. So it looks like we kind of have a max edge of, let's say 20 meters. So what we can do is we can set our max edge to be something like, instead, maybe, go down as far as you need to go depending on your computer's capabilities, but let's try 5 first. So set number 5 for your max edge, commit changes. Now all of a sudden you can see we have a much denser mesh. So we kind of have these triangles at the edges, and then we have these quads in the center. So this is a higher resolution mesh, and you can see that as we extrude it, these points up to intersect with these solar planes, this mesh will be able to deform in a much higher resolution way. You can leave your max edge at 5 for right now if you want, or if you think your computer can handle it, it's not too bad. You can decrease it as well. So right now it's not much of a, right now it's not computationally taxing, but once we solve for the intersections, that's where your computer might slow down if you have too many vertices. So 1 looks a little bit dense to me, so maybe I'll just go to 2. Okay. So what we are going to do is we are going to essentially now extrude lines from all these vertices, and we're going to intersect them with these surfaces right here. So first, let's reference all our solar surfaces. So they should be on your September 22nd, noon till 4 p.m. envelopes layer, or your March 20th, noon till 4 p.m. envelopes layer. So select all of those, and then we'll go to params, geometry, B-reps. So these might be surfaces, but just choose B-rep just in case. Put that parameter on your canvas, right-click the B-rep parameter, go set multiple B-reps to reference all these shade envelopes. And then what we can do right now is we can right-click that B-rep parameter and just rename it to be something like shadow extrusions. I keep calling them envelopes, which they kind of are. They're sort of momentary envelopes. Okay. Now, we can preview off our mesh edges component. We don't really need it. What we're going to do is we're going to draw lines from all these vertices. So let's go to curve, primitive, line SDL. And essentially what we're going to do is we're going to draw them from the vertices. So right here we have the mesh, but we need to decompose this mesh into its constituent parts. So to do that, we can go to mesh, analysis, and then let's go to deconstruct mesh. Take our mesh B-rep, the output, plug it into deconstruct mesh, and now you can see we have all the vertices. So now we're going to use line SDL. So again, that's under curve, primitive, line SDL. And what we're going to do is we're going to take the vertices output and plug into the start input of line SDL. So line SDL stands for start direction length. So the start will be all these vertices. The direction by default is straight up, which is what we want. And the length is 1 by default. Now, we're going to use a mathematical intersection, so we actually don't need to extrude these lines all the way up. But if you do want a visual representation, you could always, right click on length and set the extrusion distance to, let's say, I think I did 10,000 there or something. So you can kind of really see where they will intersect. But this actually doesn't really matter. You can leave the length as 1 if you want. So I'm just going to preview off the deconstruct mesh. And maybe what I'll do is I'll move the line SDL and the shadow extrusions kind of out of the way. And I will group all these components here because these are kind of the taking our curve outline and converting into a dense mesh. So let's group from our curve input to our deconstruct mesh / mesh edges. Group these, right click the group, and call it footprint to dense mesh. And of course, you should be saving your work constantly because Grasshopper likes to freeze sometimes. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we are going to go to intersection. And let me just see what intersection we did. Oh, I see. That is actually a good... Well, yeah. So before we do the intersection, this makes sense. What I did was I converted these shadow envelopes to meshes, and I think that's actually a better way of doing it because dealing with meshes versus B-reps is less computationally intense. So let's do it that way. So essentially what I was going to do here was just do the intersection between B-reps and lines, but it actually makes more sense to do it between these lines and the mesh representations of these shadow envelopes. So in other words, what we're going to do first is we're just going to go to Mesh, Utilities, and then go Mesh B-rep, like we'd done earlier, converting our boundary surface to a mesh. And for this, we'll just take our shadow extrusions, plug into the B-rep input, and then now, you know, we have mesh versions of these shadow envelopes. So you can see they just look like this. So very simple meshes. Now what we can do is now we can do the intersection. So let's go to intersect. Let's go to mesh ray. Now the other thing with this kind of technique versus the B-rep is we actually don't need the line SDL. You can keep it here if you want a visualization, but you can also turn it off, because mesh ray kind of has that line SDL built into it. So what I mean is if we look at the input, it says mesh, we want to intersect. Those will be our solar envelopes. The point to start the ray will be our vertices, and the direction will be up. So essentially it does the same thing as line SDL, where it says start, the vertices, direction, up, but then line SDL adds a length. So essentially mesh ray just adds the functionality of line SDL into this component. So I'll delete this line SDL. You can keep it if you want to see the visualization of the lines going up and where they will intersect. So the shadow extrusions, which have been converted to meshes, will plug into the mesh input. The points are going to be our vertices. And for the direction, we want straight up. So to do that, we can go to vector, vector, and then unit Z. And we can plug this in there. And now you can see what's happening is we're just getting a few random points. Now, the reason why we're only getting a few random points, and I just want to make sure I am actually thinking about this right. Okay, let's go back here. So let's look at our vertices here. Mesh B-rep is all of these. And the mesh is right there. Oh, sorry. There is one step we need to do. So for the mesh ray intersection, what it's doing right now is you can see that all the points are focused on one mesh right here. So if we select, let's say, let's find it, this one right here, I'll click isolate. You can see that all the mesh intersections are kind of scattered across. It looks like this mesh, you know, there might be other ones that are scattered across this mesh, but the reason why it's doing this is because it's considering all these meshes as separate objects. So what we need to do is we need to go to Mesh, Utilities, Mesh Join, and put a mesh join between the Mesh B-rep. So the Mesh B-rep that represents our shadow planes and the mesh ray. And then so essentially what's going to happen here is this now counts as one mesh. We can plug that in. And now you see we get the proper intersections right there. So essentially you should have something that looks like this. So does anyone have any questions about that process? All right. So from here, essentially what we're going to do, and this time I'm going to make sure to refer to my notes before I sort of move ahead. Right. Is we are going to essentially sort out the points that intersected and the points that don't. Now, the reason why we're doing this is that right now you can see that I have all these planes and they completely cover my site, right? So this looks good, but what happens if, let's say, I delete some of these planes? So I'm just going to delete these. Maybe I'll leave those. And the reason why I'm doing this is you might have a situation, and it might be a good thing for you to find this situation, or maybe even artificially create this situation, but you might have a situation where the shadow envelopes don't fully cover your site or your the footprint of your building. And essentially what that means is that you don't have to worry about falling within the shadow envelope at that point. So for example, you know, if I was going to roughly draw this out, you know, I have a curb like this, and if it casts a shadow like that, and a building across the street fell under the shading envelope from here, so those are dashed lines indicating a hidden building. You know, if you still had a portion of the building that was, you know, wraps around the corner of that site, maybe then if you have another tower, let's say right here, that tower could be higher than the shadow envelope, because let's say you don't have to worry about shading the area down here. So essentially what happens is this one tower is affected by the shadow envelope, but you have another tower that isn't. So that's the reason why I'm sort of, instead of just using these mesh ray points, you can see that now what's happening is, if not all your points intersect, it's not that you are just left with these points are on the ground. What happens is that you get these null points, right? So that's no good. These just mean no intersection. So what we can do is we can use a component called pick and choose to sort of alternate between the points which are on the ground and the points which are sort of in the sky. So what we're going to do is we are going to grab the elevations of these intersection points and then the elevations of these points down here. So let's go to vector point deconstruct. And these points, so coming out of our mesh ray intersection, we're going to plug into the point input. And you see what that's doing is it's just breaking up into their X component, their Y component, their Z component. The Z component is what we're sort of after right here. You can see that just like these points here, if there is no value, then it's just a null. So that's why we have the nulls in here, because it doesn't intersect. The other points we want, or the elevations we want, are these ones down here. So what we can do is we can again grab a vector, point, deconstruct. We can take our vertices and we can plug them into the point input of deconstruct. And again, you can see what this is doing is this is just giving us a value of 0. And these are sort of, you know, they're just all the points. They're on the C-plane. So yours might give you a standard value of, let's say, like, you know, 2. Maybe if your of your curve is slightly off the C-plane, but mine are on the C-plane, so they're giving me a value of 0. So again, this is the elevation. And what we're going to do is we're going to use this hit value. So Boolean indicating a hit or miss that's coming out of the mesh ray intersection. And we're going to say choose a Z value from here if the hit value is true, or choose a Z value, or sorry, choose a Z value from here. So the elevated points, if there's a hit of true, or use a value from down here if the hit value is false. So essentially what we can do is we can go to sets, list, pick and choose. The pattern is going to be hit. And again, true equals 1, right? So you can see that our hit, when it equals true right here, so the first value in this list is true, you can see the first value that's going into pattern equals 1. So the 1 corresponds to stream 1. So the points which hit are the ones that are up here. So we can take the Z values from these points and plug them into stream 1. Now the points that didn't hit are our base values down here. And what we can do is we can plug the Z component from our base values down here. We can plug into stream 0. And now you can see what happens here is we have these elevations, and wherever there is not a, or where before there was a null value, now there is a 0. So we're just essentially replacing those. Now, I just thought of like a shortcut we can do here. Can anyone think of the shortcut we can make? So if our rules are you can either go up to this shading envelope or you can go to a maximum height of 250 meters. Can anyone think of like a little shortcut we could put in here? Okay, so what I'm thinking is instead of, you know, grabbing the zeros from my my points right here, so the elevation of these points, my vertices, which are 0, we could actually just put in the max elevation, right? So in our notes, if we look at our notes, our max height equals 250, so we could always just replace stream 0 with a bunch of 250s. So why don't we do that instead? So what we can do is we can delete our deconstruct right here. So just delete the deconstruct. You can see now that there's nulls back in this list. And wherever there wasn't an intersection, we can just replace them with our max height right there. So what we can do now is we could go to, we can make a slider. So let's double click on the canvas. Let's set the minimum to be 10, the maximum to be 500. So just in case you want to play around with this, I just clicked enter to put a slider on the canvas. I'm going to right click it. I'll call it max height. And essentially what I'm going to have to do now is, you see if you plug it straight into stream 0, it's going to give us an error. it's going to say input stream too short for pattern. So what that means is we need our max height value. We need as many of these values as we have the pattern. So what we can do is we can just go to sets, list length. Our pattern comes from this hit boolean, so plug the hit into list length. And now we can go to sets, sequence repeat data, plug the length output into the length input, plug the max height into the data input, and now you can see we have max height of 10 repeated 2,715 times in my case. So I can plug that into stream 0. And now wherever a point did not intersect with these envelopes, it essentially is assigned the value of the max height is defined. So in the case of this project, it's 250. So I can change this slider to 250. So in a nutshell, to sum up what's going on here, and I'll just zoom out on this, is that these points, if they intersect, we take the elevation of the intersection. If they don't intersect, we take the elevation of the max height defined by this slider. So does anyone have any questions about that? I'm going to group all of these components because I think, because that's a good point to group. So I'm going to right click this and I'll call it elevations from intersections. Okay, so the one final thing we need to do here is if we scroll through our list, and this might not be your case, but you'll notice that there's some points here, some elevations that actually have a value that's higher than 250. And this might come from a point like, let's say this point right here, where, you know, technically it still is under the shadow envelope, but because it's over the max height, that would go against the bylaws. So what we're going to do is we're going to replace all values that are higher than the max value with the max value. So to do so, we can go to Math, Operators, and then we can go to smaller than. So let's take the first number. So the first number is going to be our results here. The second number is going to be our max height, is defined by this slider. So now you can see we have a bunch of trues, but we do have some falses. So, you know, see a bunch of trues, it's not bigger than 250, but you know, dispersed throughout here, there's a bunch of falses too. So I'm assuming all those falses are these points up here, right? So now what we can do is we can use pick and choose again. So let's go to sets, list, pick and choose. The pattern will be our smaller than. So let's take our smaller than. We can say smaller than or equal to. Plug the pattern in there. So if it's true, again, true equals 1, so stream 1. So let's take the results of our previous pick and choose and plug into stream 1. And if it's not true, that equals stream 0. And we can take our repeat data, which is all of these max heights. So max height 250, it's just repeated the length of the overall pattern. So we can take this repeat data and plug into stream 0 again. So that's sort of reusing this component. And now we have our proper elevations. So simple as that, we can group those two components. And I'll call this group replacing values greater than 250, or I'll just say max height with max height. And again, if I was doing this for my assignment, you know, maybe I'd put a note to myself explaining what I was doing here. So I'd say if a value was greater than 250, replace it with 250 using pick in choose, something like that. Okay, so now what we need to do is we need to rebuild these points. So we've been assigning them elevations, but these aren't actual data. So to do this, what we can do is we can go to vector, point, construct point. Now, elevations are the z coordinate, so we can take our pick and choose, our final pick and choose, and plug into the z coordinate. You can see we have a bunch of points. There are 0, 0, and then z coordinate. And then what we can do is we can go all the way back to our vertices right here. So our deconstruct mesh vertices, and we'll deconstruct the vertices. So what we'll do is we'll go to vector, point, deconstruct. So vector, point, deconstruct. Take our vertices, plug them into the deconstruct point, drag this component all the way to the front of our definition, or I guess almost the front, just right behind our construct point, and take the x component and the y component and plug into the x coordinate and y coordinate. Because if you think about it, the x and y hasn't changed, our plan hasn't changed. And what you'll see is all these points that still look the same in plan. So you can see it's still the same in plan. Maybe I'll just preview off my envelopes. Maybe I'll just preview off everything behind us here. So it still looks the same in plan, but if we look in, perspective, essentially what happens here is you can see we have our solar envelope defined by our solar planes, right? Up until the point where they reach 250 meters, which is the maximum height. And then all of a sudden that bylaw takes over and is the controlling factor for our building envelope. So what we're going to do now is we are going to rebuild a mesh. So what we can do is we can go to mesh, primitive, construct mesh. The vertices are going to be our points here. And the faces, this is kind of an interesting thing you can do with meshes. So if you look at our original, so we have our original mesh down here, right? So I'm looking at my deconstruct mesh that we have coming out of our footprint mesh. So if you look at what happens when you deconstruct a mesh, is it gives you vertices, right? Which are all these points. And each of these points has a position in a list. So one list with an address or a path 0, 0. And each of these points has an index, right? So the first point here, which has an x value of 284, a y value of -338, and a z value of 0, it has an index of 0. So it's the first point in the list because numbering starts at 0 in Grasshopper. Likewise, there's another point here that starts at, it's 285, -336, 0, and it has an index of 1. So it's the, second number in the list. So when we look at faces, I'll just grab a panel. You can see what the faces are is they're not actually geometry, right? So that's why when you deconstruct a mesh, you don't see the filled in faces. What the faces are defined as coordinates. So the way that mesh, sorry, my dog was just freaking out. The way that mesh topology works is that you can either have triangles, so you can see that's where we get this T, and then a 12, 13, and 0. And what this means is it's saying that the first face in this mesh is made up of point with an index 12. So you can say that, okay, 12, there's 12, so it gives you the coordinates of one corner of that triangular face. The next corner is 13, so here's the coordinates of the other corner of that triangular face, and then finally point 0, right? So why this is interesting, oh, and I should mention that quad faces start with a Q, so this is sort of just the syntax of describing meshes. So what's interesting is that we moved up all these vertices, right? But we still retain the same order in the list. So for instance, let's say this corner here is 0, so vertex 0. When we move it up, it's still going to be vertex 0, right? If this is vertex 1, that's still going to be vertex 1. So what that means is we can use this same topology, we can use the same coordinates for all the faces on this new set of points, and because they have the same location in the list, we'll still be able to make a mesh that makes sense. So what we can do is we can, let's just take this panel here. Maybe what I'll do is, just if you haven't, just for your own reminder, let's go to params, input panel, take your faces output, plug into the panel. We can just call this panel mesh faces, and then drag that panel up to the front of your definition. So you can see now when we're constructing the mesh, the points that are going in are our new points for the vertices, and then the faces will be our old faces. And now if we preview off all these vertices, you can see that we have sort of just a beautiful, comprehensible mesh. So that's what we're looking for here. We're just taking this shape down here and kind of scooching it up. So now that we have that, we can just group these components. Right-click the group, and I'll just call it rebuilding the top face of the mesh. So does that make sense to everyone? Does anyone have any questions about what we did there? Okay, excellent. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to preview off everything that's behind me. So those points on the ground. In Rhino, if you're like me, where you're sort of just have your footprint isolated, maybe your nodes, etc., let's just unhide everything. So the hotkey for that is Control-Shift-H, or the shortcut rather, and you can just Control-A to select everything to turn it all back on. So what you can see is now here is my envelope, and it's floating above my surface, my lot. So what I want to do now is I want to just take these edges and extrude them down, and that's to create a three-dimensional envelope. So right now we just have the top, which is three-dimensional, but it has no thickness to it. So let's extrude the sides down. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to go back to mesh analysis, and then we're going to go to mesh edges. So let's take our constructed mesh, plug it into mesh edges, and you can see here that we have naked edges, interior edges, and hopefully no non-manifold edges. But what we're concerned with is the naked edges, so the ones along the edge. So what we're going to do is these naked edges are made up of a bunch of lines, right? So straight lines. So what we can do is we can go to curve, primitive, or actually, sorry, curve, analysis, endpoints. So curve, analysis, endpoints. And this is going to give us all the starts and the ends of these edge points. So what we're going to do is we have a mesh like this. It's built up of a lot of, edge lines like so. So there's 1, there's 2, there's 3. In the other direction, 1, 2, 3, etc., etc. We've grabbed the endpoints. what we're going to do is we're just going to, in the same way, cast rays down from these endpoints, look for intersections with the lot beneath, and then we're going to create new meshes using this start point, end point, end point, start point, start point, end point, end point, start point. And that's how we're going to create the edges of this mesh. So that's what we're going towards right now. So we have our endpoints. We want to find the intersection with our site. So let's reference that. So it's a surface. Let's go to params, geometry, surface. So I'm going to right click, set one surface. Now I'm going to convert this to a mesh. Your site might already be a mesh, so we're going to work with meshes here. So when I say your site might already be a mesh, I mean after the second half of this class, you might go back and turn your site to a mesh. So you'll find out. So let's right click this surface input and just call it lot. And then let's go mesh, utilities, mesh from brep, and plug our lot into our mesh from brep. And we're going to use that same mesh ray intersection. So let's go to intersection, mathematical, mesh ray. The mesh to intersect will be the mesh from brep version of our lot. Put that in there. The ray start point, we're going to do two of these, so we'll do one for the start points. And then the direction, we want it to be down. So what we'll do is we'll go vector, vector, unit z. So vector, vector, unit z. Just move that down a bit. You can see that by default the factor for unit z is 1. We know that positive z equals up, so what we want to do is right click on our factor, go set number, set it to -1, commit changes. So this unit z with a -1 direction will plug into direction, and now you can see that we have the intersections with our site. Now, like I said, these are just the intersections for the start points. So what we're going to do is we can just copy this mesh ray component. So I just selected it and went Control C, Control V, or else you can always go edit, copy, edit, paste. But we just need two of these. So the second one here, what we're going to do is we're going to replace the start points with the end points right there. So take the end point, plug into the end output of the end points and plug into the point input. So now what we're going to do is, if you think about what's happening, we have our, like I said, our mesh edge. So right there, it has a start point and an end point. We've shot rays down to intersect with our site. And now we have our start point and our end point. So what we're going to do is we're going to essentially make a mesh face that is start, end, end, start. So we're going clockwise. Now to do that, we can use the syntax that we saw earlier. So it's a quad face, it has 4 points. So we can say Q, curly bracket, 0, semicolon, 1, semicolon, 2, semicolon, 3. So we can use that to create a mesh. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to go to merge. So let's go to set tree merge, just so we can see what order we're putting this stuff in. Let's go to, so again, that's set tree merge. Let's go to our endpoints, take the start endpoint, plug into data 1. Take the end, so that's the endpoint up here, plug into data 2. By default, a little D3 pops up. If it didn't for some reason, you can zoom into merge and click the little addition icon. D3 is going to be, remember, we want to go start, end, end, start. So grab the mesh ray intersection that's coming from end. So start, end, end, start. So this coming from end. Take the point from that mesh ray intersection, put it into D3, so data 3. And then finally, take the mesh ray intersection that's coming from this start and put it into D4. Now, you can leave D5 blank. I like to zoom into the merge component and just click the little subtract symbol to get rid of any superfluous data input. And now what you can see is we have all these like crazy, we have a lot of points in here, right? What we actually want to do is we want to graph this. So essentially what we just did is, since if you think about it, these are all in one list, this is all in one list, this is all in one list, this is all in one list, what we've done, and there's 386 items in each list in my case, what we've done is we've taken these 4 lists, or branches or buckets. There's 386 in each of them. This circle stands for 386. And we've combined them all into one thing. So now it's a bucket that has 386 times 4 things in it, right? What we actually want to do is graft all of these buckets up here. So instead, what we're doing is we're saying, okay, we have 4 big buckets, and in each of those buckets, they all have small buckets. So they have 386 small buckets in each of those big buckets. So this is what happens when we graft. We're adding a sublist for each list. So now what happens when we do this is, instead of combining the contents of the big buckets, aka 386 times 4, they're saying, okay, let's look at the small buckets in the big buckets, combine small bucket 1, small bucket 1, small bucket 1, small bucket 1. That gives you, let's call it combined bucket 1, and then combine this bucket, this bucket, this bucket, this bucket, and it gives you another one. Each of these has 4 items. So that's what we're doing here. So we need to graft all these inputs. First, let's right click and go lock solver. So whenever you're grafting a lot of stuff like this, it's good to lock your solver. Right click D1, go graft. Right click D2, go graft. Right click D3, go graft. And then D4, click graft. Just in case we have some mismatch of data, so the paths are different, is kind of a safety feature. We can also right click and go simplify for all of these. And essentially that just makes sure that all the lists are in the same format. So for each of these, I've right clicked, went graphed, and simplified. So now when I right click on my canvas and go lock solver, you can see now the data is coming in with first it's list 0, then list 1, data 2 is list 0, then list 1, data 3 is list 0, list 1, D4 is 0, 1 on, so on. And now when you see the output is list 0 that has 4 items, list 1 that has 4 items, list 2 that has 4 items, and so on and so forth. So now that all these points are grouped together properly, what we can do is we can create meshes. So we can go to vector, we can go to mesh, primitive, construct mesh. We can take our vertices, plug it into the vertices. And you can see what's happening here is that by default, the faces are quad 0, 1, 2, 3, since we have 4 items in each list. If we grab a panel and look at the items in each list, so here's our first list. So list 0, we have 0, 1, 2, 3. So again, by default, quad 0, 1, 2, 3, it's making a mesh with point 0, 1, 2, 3. And that's why this kind of works automatically, is because we know we have 4 vertices in each of these lists. So there's our mesh there. And what we can do is we can essentially, let's just group this. So we'll group all these. I'll right click it and I'll just call this creating side meshes. The final thing we can do now, I'll just preview off all this extra stuff, is we can join these meshes. So let's simply go to Mesh, Utilities, Mesh Join. The meshes that we want to put into the mesh join are going to be our construct meshes, our side meshes. But first, to join them, we need to flatten this list, because right now they're all in their own lists, branches, etc. So we can just right click the output, go flatten. So now you can see 386 values in one list. Plug that into mesh join. Now you can see one mesh as a result. And we can go and grab the top from this construct mesh in our rebuilding the top face group. So I'll plug that into my mesh join by holding shift. So when you hold shift again, you see a green arrow and a plus icon. And now you can see, so right now it says two meshes, and that's because the top mesh, you can see it has a list path of 0, 0, 0, whereas these meshes have a list of just 0. So we can actually just right click the input of my mesh join, meshes input, and right click and go flatten. And now you can see one locally defined value, one mesh. Preview off. And now you can see you have a mesh like that. Now, there's one final thing we can do, and it's called welding. And essentially what happens is, imagine you have two mesh faces like this. So these, and they share this edge here. Now you have vertex 0, vertex 1, vertex 2, vertex 3, vertex 4, vertex 5. This quad here, so let's call it quad A, quad B. A is going to have a face topology of 0, 1, 2, 3, and B is going to have a topology of, oh, I should have added 2 more points here, so 4, 5, 6, 7. That's what happened because, you know, we have overlapping vertices. This is going to have a topology of 4, 5, 6, 7. If you weld a mesh, what that does is it takes these vertices, 1 and 7 for instance, they're sharing a place, and it just combines them. So 1 and 7 would just go to 1. It would combine these overlapping vertices, so it gets rid of all the overlaps, combines them into 2. So now A's topology would still be 0, 1, 2, 3, but now B's topology would be 4, 5, 6 would go to 2, and 7 would go to 1. Now, for, you know, for sort of just modeling in Rhino, it probably doesn't matter if you have overlapping vertices if you don't weld, but this can sometimes cause an issue if you want to, let's say, 3D print, or it might cause an issue sort of down the road if you're trying to do some Boolean or intersection operations. So that's why we do it. So let's click X, and so out of this mesh join, let's just go to Mesh, Utilities, and then Weld Mesh. So where is that? Weld Mesh, right here. So weld, merge creases in a mesh. Take our mesh output, plug in, and now we have one mesh. And you can see here that the mesh join, the vertices is 4,259 vertices, 3,261 faces. That's what the V and F stands for. And the output is 4,259 vertices, 3,261 faces, as in it didn't get rid of any faces. I guess sometimes you don't need to weld, but it's a good habit to get into. We actually didn't get rid of any vertices there, but good habit to get into. So this weld mesh, we can right click it, we can go bake. Maybe first I'll make a new layer. So I'll make a new layer and I'll call this shadow / height envelope. So this weld mesh, go bake, put on shadow height envelope, save your grasshopper, And now what you can see is I have this shadow and height envelope, and I can rest assured that as long as my building falls within this envelope here, it will not shade this curb, this curb between March 20th and September 22nd, and furthermore, it is not higher than 250 meters. So this definition is kind of a powerful one in terms of really being a design driver. So does anyone have any questions before we take a 5-minute break? Yeah, Jeremy.
Sorry, I missed the second mesh or the controlling mesh.
Oh, sure, yeah. So into join mesh, we have 2 meshes. I guess a bunch of meshes. We have our side meshes, which are coming out of the construct mesh component. So that's right at the end. And then we're also putting in our construct mesh, which is coming out of our construct points component. So that's the mesh on the top here. So essentially we're just joining the top with the sides. Now, if you want to 3D print this, you'd have to, make a bottom mesh as well. And what you would do is you just do an intersection between your site, your original mesh vertices, and then you could remake the face using the same kind of method as you did here. If anyone wants me to elaborate on that, just send me an email. So what I'll do is I will leave this definition kind of up on the screen so you can see it if you need to kind of check your work against mine. And we will sort of commence class again at my clock here says 7:27, so we'll say 7:32. So it's 7:32, and 5 minutes from now we'll start up again on the second topic, which is landscaping using Bison. If you haven't downloaded Bison, go to Food for Rhino and download Bison. So that's in the syllabus, but the page should look like this. And it's the third download, not the component reference or examples. Okay, so I'll see you guys at 7:32. All right, so I'm going to proceed with doing the sort of the second portion of this class. So at this point, what we've done is we have created a shadow / max height envelope, and we've also created a footprint that this envelope is extruded from that meets our max 40% site coverage requirement, and does so in kind of a complex manner. It's not just a simple offset. So what I wanted to do before we go on to sort of further building topics in the next class is to sort of step aside and take a look at the site. So this, I hope, is just a peek at useful tools that landscape architects can use. So even though this class isn't really about 2D representation, I'm going to touch on a few things that I know that a landscape architect that I've worked with really enjoyed about this Bison plugin, as well as just sort of some useful modeling tools as well. But for everyone, I think this is a very powerful mesh editing tool, and so that's why we're going to use it. For those of you who are running Rhino 5, my apologies. I thought that Bison did work for Rhino 5. It turns out it does not. Originally, when we were going to have a whole class dedicated to this topic, I had sort of 2 ways of manipulating Topo. What I'm going to do is I'll record the second way of manipulating Topo, which is raster based. So you'll need Photoshop to do that, but it'll still work with Rhino 5. But essentially, I'll post that video later this week. So either on Wednesday, or if I don't have time before the weekend. So I'll send out an email when that video's posted. So for those of you with Rhino 5, if you want to go do something else, feel free. If you want to follow along, I think it's worth doing. And I'd encourage you, get a demo version of Rhino 6 if you can, and perhaps use Bison for your assignment too. So I'm going to go over to Site 3. And like I said, there is now a giant statue of Tom Nook. And essentially the reason why I'd done this was, as I said, I really wanted to lean into that Animal Crossing reference, and I just thought this was kind of funny. But also that I didn't want to work with a site that had, that was mostly covered. So I don't know if this is 40%. I just drew it. It seems kind of big, but you will find that 40% of your site is actually kind of bigger than you think. Remember, it's max 40%. So if you're a landscape architect and you want to focus more on the actual landscape, feel free to have something which touches the ground in a much smaller way. So in this case, it is the plinth upon which Tom Nook stands. I'm also planning on putting a few more statues in here. In particular, I need to find the right 3D model to put in the center in this roundabout. If anyone has any suggestions for what they want to see in a fountain in the center of this roundabout, please let me know. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to switch to shaded view, and the first thing I want to show you is just how to use Bison to do kind of simple grading. So what we're going to do is we're just going to assume that we want to raise a sort of platform around this Tom Nook statue. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to snap to a vertex, so make sure your vertex snap is on. And I'm just going to draw a point right here. Oh, make sure that project is off so you're actually snapping to the vertex. So snap to one vertex, and then turn on project and turn on planar. And what that's going to do is it's just going to make sure that you're drawing in the in an XY plane that's at the elevation of the first point you snap to. So in this case, I'm creating a flat curve at the elevation of this point. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to, go into plan view, and I am going to just kind of freely draw, a platform between this plinth. So like so. And maybe after the fact, what I might want to do is I might want to drag this point out a bit, like so. Now, I've drawn kind of a random, ugly, I guess it's a pentagon. Of course, this is where your good design skills will come in, so this should be considered. But what I'm doing is I'm creating a sort of plaza around the plinth. Maybe I'll drop it down a little bit so it's a little bit lower than the plinth, so there's still a footing there that is elevated from the plaza itself. And what we're going to do is we're going to reference our surface right here. So here's my lot. I'm going to reference it, so I'll go to parameters, geometry, surface. I'll right click on this surface. I'll go set one surface. And then I want to reference this curve as well. So my kind of flat platform. So to reference this, I'll go to parameters, geometry, curve. I'll right click this parameter, go set one curve. I'll right click on this surface parameter and I'll just call it a lot surface, just a little bit more descriptive. And this curve, I will just call it maybe elevated platform curve. One thing that I do like about Bison is it seems you know, it has analytical tools, but also it's a little bit more, I don't know how to say it, like free form modeling. So you'll see what I mean when I say that. So this lot surface, essentially what we're going to do is we are going to convert it to a mesh. So that's why I was saying here that your site might be a mesh, because a monolith works with, or Bison works with meshes. You'll find that more and more Rhino is working with meshes, because meshes as geometry, you know, gets more and more complicated, and there's more kind of crosstalk between Rhino and Revit, Rhino and SketchUp, Rhino and programs like Blender, Unreal, etc. Meshing is just becoming something that, you know, designers who work a lot in digital environments are having to get comfortable with. So Bison's going to work with meshes. So let's go to Bison, or sorry, let's go to Mesh, Utilities, Mesh BREP. So Mesh, Utilities, Mesh BREP. We'll take the lot surface, plug into the BREP. And we're not going to worry about the settings at this moment, because Bison actually has a tool to change this mesh. So what we can do is we can go to Bison, and then we're going to go to Mesh, and then we're going to go to Remesh Triangular. That's what I've been using. Now, so if we hover over it, it says resample a landscape e-mesh with a triangular grid. And essentially what this is doing, in the same way we sort of increase the resolution of our footprint mesh in order to sample those shadow envelopes above, Bison will help us resample our lot mesh in order to perform smoother mesh deformations to the site. So the mesh input will be the mesh to resample. It'll be our mesh from BREP of our lot surface. The grid is the dimension of the sampling grid, and what that refers to is that the way it works, I'm assuming, is it takes a mesh. So here's our crazy mesh. Could have just drawn a square, and it assigns a bunch of points across it, kind of like we did with our vertices, right? From there, it just rebuilds a mesh. So it draws triangles between these points, like so. For those of you who have taken my old classes, when I worked with a laptop, I had a, you know, the screen which I could draw on. I'm now just drawing with a mouse on my desktop, so that's why my drawings have gone even worse. So anyways, that's what it's doing. But the grid refers to the size between those sample points. So for example, if we go to grid set number 1, so we can just set number to be 1. It might take a moment. Essentially what that means is it's sampling every 1 meter. So we can't really see what's going on here, but what we can do if we want is we can go to Mesh, Analysis, and then Mesh Edges, just to see what's happening. Take our mesh output, plug into the mesh input, and you can see that it has resampled this triangular mesh at quite a fine detail. So fine then that honestly I think I might increase the grid size to make it go a little bit faster, so maybe I'll increase the grid number to 2. So that looks more than dense enough. You know, you might be able to get away with 4 or something. You'll see in a moment though why you might want to have a denser grid. I don't know why it hasn't caught this corner, but that's okay. Anyways, so what we're gonna do now, I'm kind of annoyed that it didn't catch that corner. That's silly. So if we set our grid to be 1, yeah, then it gets closer. I'm gonna say it's okay if it loses that 1 corner. So anyways, I'll just set it to 2, sorry, just noticed that. But anyways, what Bison's going to do is it's going to take this platform that we've drawn, and it's going to essentially raise the ground up to this flattened portion. So essentially we're going to create, I think it's called a berm, I believe is the proper term. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to Bison, we're going to go to Mesh Edit, and we're going to go to Mesh Flat. So Edit Mesh with a flat region defined by a curve. So the mesh to edit will be our remesh triangular mesh, and the curve will be our elevated platform curve. Now the width, this is kind of interesting. Essentially this is going to define essentially how steep or how shallow this the mesh transitions from this flat surface up here to the original shape. So what we can do is we can create a number slider. So let's double click on the canvas, and I will say minimum 1, maximum let's say 250. So 250 meters. Click enter, and we can let's set it at 20 at first, and let's plug into width, and you can see what happened is it has created a flat surface in our mesh with a width of 20. So if we increase this slider, you can see it's getting a smoother slope up towards this flat land. So let's bake this mesh and see what it looks like. So view, rendered. That's pretty cool. So you can essentially edit your mesh like this. And that's what I meant when I said that Bison's kind of, it seems like a little bit more of a free-form modeling program to me, or an add-on rather than, you know, some components we traditionally associate with Grasshopper, because I definitely see it as more something that you kind of are actively working with in Grasshopper while having, or in Rhino while having your Grasshopper components open and sort of previewing the changes you're making. So anyways, that's how you create a flat surface. What I might want to do at this point, if, you know, let's say I want to make some sort of flat deck on top of this, I might take the vertices. So what I've done right now is I've just extended my vertices outside my site to get rid of the weird slope toward the short way through the site. So just make sure projects on, planar is on, and you would just align your vertices with your curve. Of course, this might also be a really not so great site design because I have these two giant hills kind of facing the sidewalks, but that's okay. I think that if you want to have this sort of condition on your site, I say go for it. So what you can do is now you have this hill. If you want to make something that's more of a hardscaped element on top of this, you could simply take your elevated platform curve, go to surface, freeform, extrude, and the direction would be vector, unit Z, and then the thickness of your slab, if you do indeed want it elevated above your ground, you could just create a slider for it. So you could go, maybe you want a slab that's, you know, in line with the ground, so it's flat, so maybe you go negative, let's say 1.00, because we're working in meters, to, you know, let's say max 3.00. So essentially what we're doing here is we're extruding a slab, and then we can cap it. So we can go surface, utilities, cap holes, cap this, and then bake it. and then of course bake the flat mesh. I haven't really made a site for it, I should do that. And then essentially you now have this softscape leading up to a hardscape, which you can of course edit. So I think that's really quite straightforward, but now what we're going to do is we're going to add some complexity to this. But does anyone have any questions about this before we kind of continue on? Maybe what I'm going to do if, well, Colin, would it work with multiple curves? So yeah, we're getting to that. So I'll show you how you can kind of stack different values. So what I'm going to do is, maybe what I might want to do is I'm going to make a new layer. I'll call it landscape. I can make a new sublayer. I'll call it hardscape. And then a new layer, softscape. And then another new layer, and call it anno, because I do want to show you some annotation. Okay. So, just changing the colors here. Okay. So now what I have is my hardscape there and my softscape. So Colin's question is, would it work with multiple curves? And it does, but I find that what you need to do is you need to start kind of stacking kind of transformations in Bison. And that's kind of where I've had the best luck with it. And that's why I say it's kind of more of a free-form modeling program more than anything. Because what I mean is, if we delete this surface, if I want to add another flat surface, what I would do is I would then draw my other flat surface that I wanted. Perhaps it would be at a different elevation. So let's just pull it back under my site. Making sure it's above my site so it can kind of already intersect with the hills there. But what you can do is you can now go to param, geometry, curve, reference another curve, so set one curve. And then again, just copy this mesh flat component and the number slider. And now plug the curve. So the new curve I'm referencing right here. So this one right here. Plug that into the curve input, and then your previous mesh flat output into the new mesh flat input. And you can see what it starts to do is it starts to just add up these curves. So we can change the number slider to make this hill a lot steeper right there. So now if I bake this mesh, you can see what I have is this kind of quite steep landform that would be, you'd need some sort of, I believe, some sort of retaining wall or something underneath to actually make this work. But you're starting to get this kind of build up of landscape. Maybe something that's a little bit more realistic would be, something like this. But that's how you start to build up flat platforms in Grasshopper using Bison. So what I want to talk about now is the idea of creating a path. So actually, before I do that, just so I make sure I have time to cover it, is I do also want to briefly talk about the annotations in Bison. So when you're working with this, it's kind of, like I said, it's a little bit of a different dynamic than most Grasshopper workflows. So I would just try to group things in smaller portions just so you don't lose track of things. So what I did here was I grouped my lot surface, my mesh BWrap, my remesh, and I can just call this, let's say, original remesh. Anything that I might be using to create, let's say, a hardscape extrusion, I might just rename it and call it hardscape. maybe just call it like hardscape number 1, because you might make a couple of these. You might also just model something like that in Rhino. Okay, and then from here you just kind of have steps that'll move forward. So at this point I'm not sure how much you need to worry about grouping these. What I did want to show you though was some of the annotations that you have access in here. So if you go to Bison and go to analysis first, one thing that's really interesting is essentially, so there's a bunch of things that are interesting here, but the one I want to look at in particular is flow. Cut fill would be another one that's kind of really interesting, but to be honest, I haven't checked it out, so I'll leave that to you guys to work with. But flow, and essentially this is just going to measure and depict the way that water runoff is going to behave on your site. So the boundary curve essentially is just going to be the boundary for analysis. So in this case, what we can do is we can take, let's say our surface, which we've referenced at the beginning of our definition. So we have lot surface here. We can go to surface, analysis, and then go to brep edges. So take our lot surface, plug it into brep edges, bring it to the front there. We want the naked edges, so the outside edges of this lot. We're going to join them, so we'll go to curve, utilities, join curves. So the naked edge curves we're going to plug into the curves input. Now you can see that we have one closed curve coming out. So we have our flow component from Bison. What we're going to do is we're going to take our join curves output, plug it into the boundary input. Our mesh will be whatever mesh we want to analyze. So in this case, it's the last mesh that is a result of these two raised flattened areas. And then the grid for analysis, that's the same thing as the analysis grid for our original remeshing. So if you look at this, essentially our original mesh size was 2. Now, if we're doing a flow analysis, you probably don't need, that type of spacing. So what we can do is we can set our grid to something a little bit bigger. Let's say off the top of my head, 8. So that, one flow analysis point per every 4 spaces in our grid. And then steps. Essentially, what steps means is if you think of like a little raindrop rolling down the hill, let's leave steps till after we talk about length. Length is going to be the segment of the step. So for example, if you're running a tap of water, and you were to measure the stream that's coming out of the tap, if there is a distance between the tap and the bottom of your sink of, let's say like a quarter of a meter, it's kind of a big sink, your length would be a quarter of a meter. So in this case, let's just set our length to be, I don't know, like 2 meters. It's the density of this grid. And then the steps, essentially what that is if we have like, a hill that looks like this in section, and we're analyzing this little raindrop that's coming down the hill, as it hits the ground, that's its path, its step for its length, so essentially 2. But that's just one step. So the second step would be this extent of its little journey. So 2 divided by the length. Third step would be there. So that's essentially what a step means. So steps, we can set it to something like 10, and now you can see we're starting to get this rain flow analysis. Now the step, it doesn't look like it's maybe quite long enough because we get these raindrops which don't traverse all the way they need to. So we can increase our step to like 100. And now you can see this gives you a pretty good example, or a pretty good idea of the way water is going to flow on this site. So these come out as polyline curves. So you can see that, you know, you might have to sort of, you know, figure out how to deal with pooling in this site. This site actually looks like it's draining pretty well. I'm sure that there are some areas here that wouldn't be great. Probably people walking on the sidewalk right here wouldn't like this, but this is going to help you figure out where you want to change the aggregate, or maybe you want silva cells or some sort of below grade rainwater remediation strategy. So I hope that this is useful for some of you. The other thing that I find extremely useful in here is under the annotation, there's contour, and architects, you'll like this as well. So Grasshopper makes contours easy, but one thing that I have been using this for is using contours with tags. So for example, your mesh, we plug into the mesh input. The interval is, you know, let's say like every 0.5 meters. The height, so text height for elevation tags is going to be essentially the size of your text. So let's say 1. In tags, distance between elevation tags is going to be the distance between these tags along the elevation curve. So for instance, if I put something like 2, they're going to be way too close. So you can see the elevations are way too close. But if I set it to be something like 20, so every 20 meters, that's still pretty close in plan. But you can see how, let's set every, you know, like 100 meters or something. This is starting to give you a really nice, easy way to set out contours and elevations. So I think that's worth showing to everyone. So you can bake these, you know, like anything else. So you have the curves, and then you have the text. So that all comes out quite well. The final thing I'll show you is just the slope grid. So there's a bunch of ways to do slope. I'll just show slope grid because it's kind of the easiest right now. But it's the same thing where you're going to analyze your mesh. You're going to define a density for your analysis. So in this case, let's do an analysis every, let's say, 5 meters. And the final thing here is height of your text. That analysis point's actually probably too big or too small, so I'm going to set my grid number to, let's say, again, 20. You know, sort of season to taste. However many slope points you need, you can sort of do what you need. So, and again, this will come up a lot more for landscape architects, but you know, doing your slope markups like this, especially for dealing with paths, the project I'm personally working on right now, we need to maintain you know, 5% slope because that's accessible everywhere, and this component has been really helpful with visually confirming that we are under 5%. So you can see we have all sorts of crazy slopes in the site right now. But I just wanted to bring up those annotation and kind of analysis tools. There's also section tools that you can work with, but just to sort of show you that Bison is really, really powerful. We don't really have time to explore it in this course, nor will we be handing in a 2D drawings for this course, so that's why I'm not really going into it in detail. But I just wanted to make you aware of this, especially for the landscape architects, because I feel that this would be a very valuable set of tools. So does anyone have any questions about those annotative and analysis tools in Bison? Okay, so if that's the case, what I'm going to show you how to do is now how to create a sloped path that has a constant slope. So Bison's really good for doing this, and this is something that I think is honestly, it seems like it always causes trouble for tons of people, myself included, because it is quite a hard thing to do. And the thing which I'm referring to is, given a complex surface, so even something as simple as, let's say, this, how do you create a flat path across it? So how do you create a road without a cross slope? And Bison's quite good at doing that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create sort of a twisty, windy path from, let's say, my Tom Nook altar, so up to this flat platform here, down to my edge, maybe right there. And then I'm going to essentially make sure that the slope of my path is constant. And then I'm going to use Bison to make sure it's also flat and doesn't have any cross slopes. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to draw my path in plan. So I'm just going to preview off all this annotation stuff. For all this annotation stuff, you can just group it and call it extra annotation. So, okay. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to draw a curve. So again, the idea of this curve I'm drawing is I'm drawing the center line of a path. For those of you who were in my last design media class, it's similar to drawing the center point of that bridge. So I'm going to make kind of a twisty curve like this. And this twisty curve, I didn't really, I guess I'd project on, planar on, but so mine is flat, so you can see it was drawn underneath. And what I want you to do, maybe yours isn't flat. If that's the case, that's okay. Just go into your top view, go transform, project to C-plane, delete input objects, yes. And now what you should be left with is just a flat curve in plan. This sort of the center line of your path. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use the gumball. So again, gumball is, if you look at the bottom of your Rhino screen, you can turn on gumball by just clicking gumball there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to define the top of this path and the bottom of this path. So what I'll do is I'll just grab, so I'll select my path. If you don't have these control points on, you can just press F10 to turn them on. I can't press F10 because it stops the video recording, but if you go to, where is it? Oh, it's edit control points on. And essentially that'll just turn on these control points, which usually turn on automatically in Rhino 6 anyways. And what you can do is you can just essentially move them to the top where you want sort of the end of this path. So what I'm going to do is maybe I'll select that point, go transform move, turn off project, and I'll just move it to a place that is sort of the end elevation of this path. Likewise, I'm going to move this curve point to the place where this point intersects with my lot, my surface. And I mean, if you don't have a point that you can sort of snap to right now, an easy way to figure out a snapping point is simply to turn on project, turn on planar, click on your polyline tool or type polyline. With project and planar on, you can see how I'm drawing a point, but it's actually drawing it on the C-plane. Turn off project, and that will create a straight line going from like straight up towards the end of your point. And then with this line here, just click the split button or type split, and then delete the lower portion of this line. And essentially why I do that is it just allows me to take the end of this path and go transform move to the end point and essentially move it down to this exact point right there. So I just intersect this curve with my lot in order to snap the end of my path to that end point. So So now what we have here is we have this path. Center the line of the path. It goes from this raised elevated platform, and then it goes down to the lot here. But you can see it's kind of a crazy curve. Like there's a very extreme slope here. There's hardly any slope there, and then there's this weird round slope there. So what we want is we want a constant slope from the top to the bottom. So that'll be a nice path with a constant slope. So we can do that in Grasshopper. So what we're going to do is we'll reference this curve in Grasshopper. We'll go to Parameters, Geometry, Curve. I'll right-click this parameter, go Set One Curve. I'll right-click this parameter again, and I will call it Path Centerline. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to figure out the top elevation and the bottom elevation of this curve. So easy enough, I'll go to Curve, Analysis, Endpoints. My path centerline reference curve will plug into the curve input. The start point of my curve, the end point of my curve, and from these I can decompose these points to find their elevation. So I'll go to Vector, Point, Deconstruct Point. I need two of these, so again it's Vector, Point, Deconstruct Point. Take our start output, plug into the point input, take our end output, plug into the point input, and now you can see the Z component is 33.24, so that's the elevation of this point right here, all the way to 22.83, which is the elevation of this point here. What we're going to do is we're going to create a domain out of these points. So what we'll do is we will go to no, we won't. We'll go to Maths, Domain, Construct Domain. So that's Math, Domain, Construct Domain. Domain Start will be our line start. Domain End will be our line or curve end. So Z component out of our endpoint goes into domain end. And this essentially just gives us a domain of the curve's elevations, so 33 to 22. It doesn't matter if the beginning of your domain is a larger number than the end of your domain. Domains can go in either direction, it doesn't matter. So what the idea we're going to do here is we are going to take our three-dimensional curve, we're going to project it to the C-plane, we're going to divide it like so, and then what we're going to do is we are going to take elevations from this domain and then assign them to this curve that's been projected in a evenly distributed way. And the reason why we project it is let's say we had a curve that, you know, had some crazy kink in it. You know, it was, let's look at this in elevation. Like, let's say we had something that was like that, and then we wanted to divide this curve to change the elevation points of this curve. If we have something that's like this, essentially what's going to happen is that points in plan are essentially going to gather up. So here, why don't I explain what I mean by taking our path to center line and then going to curve, division, divide curve. So what divide curve does is it divides this curve into equally length segments, right? So the length from this point to this point measured across this curve is equal to the length from this point to this point. But if you consider this in plan, what you'll see is that a point that, let's say, is like this, in plan, this distance is longer than this distance here. So when you remap the elevations of these points, what you'll find is that that the slope will be shallower from this point to this point, and it'll be steeper from this point to this point. And if our goal is to have a constantly sloping curve, that just won't do. So that's why we project our curve before we map points across it. So I'll just delete that divide curve. What we're going to do is our path center line will go to transform, affine, project. And again, what project does is it just essentially flattens our curve in the XY plane, or a plane of your choice, but XY plane, the default works well for us here. And then what we'll do is we'll go to curve, division, divide curve. So divide a curve into equal length segments. And now you can see that we have this curve which is divided into equal length segments. And if we look at it in plan, can't really see it, so I'll preview off our site there. In plan, these points are, equal length segments apart. So this is what we want. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to draw a curve through these points. So we probably want to control the amount of points that we have here. So it's essentially the resolution of the rebuilt curve. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a slider. I'll double click on the canvas. I'll go from, the smallest resolution of division 10. I'll type less than, so shift and comma, and I'll increase it up to a resolution of 100, and I'll hit enter. And I can right click this slider at the number slider tag, and I can call it curve resolution. And now I can plug this into count. And if I increase this, it'll just increase the amount of division. So, it really depends on the complexity of your curve. But just play around and see if you get different values or different kind of curves from different resolutions, and sort of adjust it to what works best for you. I'll leave it something like that. Now what we're going to do is we have all these points here. We have this domain here. What we're going to do is we are going to go to set, sequence, and then range. So create a range of numbers. And if we hover over range, it says create a range of numbers. What a range is essentially given a domain, so in this case between 33 and 22, create numbers that are equally spaced within that domain for a given amount of steps. So our domain here is our constructed domain between our top elevation and our bottom elevation. So let's plug that domain into domain. And the number of steps will be our curve resolution, because we want a point for each curve division. So let's plug curve resolution into steps, and then you can see it gives us 31 numbers. So you might be asking, why 31 numbers when our curve resolution is 30? If you look at our points, we also have 31 points. So why 31 points when our divide curve count is 30? And the reason is let's say you have a curve like this. So that's one curve, and you divide it into 3 segments. So there's segment 1, there's segment 2, there's segment 3. If you think about the points surrounding those segments, you have point 1, 2, 3, 4. And likewise, domain, if you think of a domain that is, from 33 to 22, and let's say you say 2 steps, so step 1, step 2, there's going to be a number between those 2 steps, so you'll have 3 numbers. So that's why we have 1 number coming out of the range and 1 extra point coming out of the division points. But what we can do now is we can take our divide curve points. We can go to vector, point, deconstruct. Take our points output, plug into the points input. And then what we're going to do is we're just going to replace our Z components, which are now all 0 because they've been projected to the C plane. And we're going to replace them with the values that come out of our range. So we'll go to vector, point, construct point. The x coordinate will come from the X component. It's weird that it's X component out, but X coordinate in, not X coordinate out. Just realize that. So X component goes to X coordinate, Y component goes to Y coordinate, and our range goes to the Z coordinate. And now what you see is you have all these points, and what they are representing is evenly sloped points across the same curve and plan. So what we can do now is we can just draw a curve through them. So we can go to curve, spline, interpolate. So that was curve, spline, interpolate. And take our constructed, or our construct points, point output, plug into the vertices. And now you can see we have this constantly sloped curve. So this curve has a constant slope across it. Now we can group all of these. I know that's kind of a big group. I was sort of leaving a little bit of grouping behind, I guess, just so we can get through everything. So we could, call this group creating a constantly sloped curve. Oh, I cannot type anymore. And if this were your assignment 2, what you might want to do is grab a panel and put a couple panels in here explaining what you are doing. So this is my reasoning here in my own words. This is what's going on. So that's kind of what I want to see for, all of the assignments. So add to group. So there's that definition. So we can preview off everything except for our constantly sloping curve. So you can see there is quite a difference between our original curve and our nice constantly sloping one. So does anyone have any questions before I move back into Bison for just a few short things? Okay, so that's good. What we're going to do is we're going to do 2 steps in Bison. So it's kind of strange, but Bison, you need to pull up the ground to a curve and then flatten it. You can't just flatten it up to a curve, and I'll show you what I mean. So we're going to go to Bison, we're going to go to Mesh Edit, and then we're going to go to Mesh Curve. So that's Bison, Mesh Edit, Mesh Curve. Take our interpolated curve, plug into the curve input of mesh curve, and the mesh input's going to come from the last Bison, or the last Bison step you have. So in this case, it's my last output from my mesh flat. Now this could just be, something else for you. Maybe it's your original site mesh, but it's probably going to be sort of, you're probably already applied some Bison steps to your mesh. So let's take that flat mesh output, plug it into my mesh input, and then the last thing we need is slope for edge curve. And essentially what this is it is a slope, I believe it's in degrees, that is the maximum angle up to this curve. So let's create a slider. I'll double click. I'll say 1 degree less than 90 degrees, hit enter, and I'll plug that into slope. Now, this is kind of interesting, and maybe what we want to do is do a custom preview for this so we can see what's going on. So let's go to Display, Preview, Custom Preview. Let's take our mesh output, plug it into geometry, and let's preview off our mesh curve, and as well as all our other meshes. So maybe what I'll do is for my material, I'll right click and go set one material and choose sidewalk. Do any of these look better? Not really. I was hoping that if we set one of the existing materials here, it would kind of give us something that's a little bit more visible of a preview, but it's not really. So maybe let's just delete the custom preview and let's just bake a few of these to see what it looks like. I'll bake the mesh curve with my slider down to, let's say, 1. Go bake. And let's set our view to rendered. And you can see what it's doing is and essentially, and actually I think this might refer to %, I need to refer to the documentation again, but essentially what it's doing is it's giving us this nice, ish kind of landscaping where the landscape is following this path, but it's doing so in a way that maintains a 1% slope, so at all points. So if we, let's say, increase this value to, let's say 60, and then we bake it, now you can see what's happening is it's just creating like literally just this crazy like built up hill that follows this path, because we've allowed for a much more dramatic slope. So this is a really powerful tool. It just allows you to follow a curve like this. Now, of course, you might want to kind of edit this afterwards. You might want to put some sort of retaining wall at this point because this mesh does look a little bit rough. You might also want to increase the resolution of your mesh, but I think kind of starting with this, it's a really interesting tool. Now, where you can use this kind of in an interesting way is if you look at our mesh right here, you can see that it is raising our landform up to this curve, but it's not really creating a path per se, it's just sort of bringing it up to a point. After you do this, you can go back into Bison, and you can go to Bison, Mesh Edit, and then it is Mesh Path. Yes, it's Mesh Path. And you can take your mesh that is coming out, your mesh curve component, plug into your mesh input. Your curve will be your same interpolated, constantly sloped curve. Plug into curve. And then the final input is your width. So this is the width of your path in your unit. So in our case, it's meters. So let's create a new slider. I'll double click on the canvas and I'll say we can have a minimum path width of 0.50 meters. So half a meter, a really skinny path. 2, so less than, and let's say a wide path like 5 meters, which you would perhaps use for vehicular access. So kind of lost that there. So 0.05 or 0.5 to 5.00, hit enter, and we can plug that into width. And now if we bake that, you can see what it does is it creates this flat path on top of your landscape like so. So, I mean, this is a really kind of dramatic kind of landscaping. It's like this like crazy path up to this, of course in this case it's like this giant, pagan idol or something, but you can use this in much more, I'd say, what would be more realistic ways. So for example, just decrease your slope, and then when you flatten out with your mesh path, you have something that looks much nicer. Now, if you want to make a hardscape path on top of your mesh, you can just take your interpolated curve like so, and you can just offset it. So you can go to Curve, Utilities, Offset Curve, take your interpolated curve, plug into your curve. The distance can be based on your width that you've flattened out using Bison. So what we can do is we want to create an expression in our distance. So we can right click the distance input, go expression, go x divide by 2, plug our mesh path width into our distance. So it's offsetting on one side. We need it offset on both sides, so we can go to math, operators, negative. Where is that? Negative. Plug our slider into negative. Hold shift till we see the green little arrow and the plus icon. Also plug into the distance. Now we have the two offset sides of our path. And now we can simply flatten the output. And, you know, we could clean this up, but really loft will work. So we can go surface, freeform, loft. Put our curves in here. And there is a surface path, which you could extrude in Grasshopper using the extrude command, or you can just simply extrude in Rhino if you want to. So have a little path above your landscape. So essentially this would go on the hardscape layer, this would go on the softscape layer. So change object layer, and you know, this is kind of what you have. I don't think we have separate materials here, but you know, you can imagine that that's how you differentiate like this. Now, the one last thing, and I know we're going over as per usual, the one last thing I want to mention here that I did notice is with this path command, you'll sometimes get situations where it'll sort of affect parts of the site where you didn't want it to. So for example, in this case, we've elevated this back portion of the site to the height of the path for some reason. So what I would say you can do is just go back into Grasshopper and delete and bake your mesh that you had before you had your path. So in this case, it's the mesh with the two flattened areas. Bake that. So I'm just baking onto my softscape layer. So now I have these two meshes, right? One below, one above. I'm just going to isolate these. And simply what I'd do is I'd just split them. So I'd just draw a line across a point that they both share. So like that. And then I'd go to mesh tools and then trim. So mesh trim, I would trim that. So that's the mesh that was kind of from my path layer. And it was covering my flat section layers, and then I'd trim that. So I'd trim also the mesh that didn't have the path information on that side, and then I'd just simply join those. So standard join or type join, and then now you have your path, but you also have your mesh with all your kind of topography information like so. So from here, you know, you could add in steps. Maybe I'll add another, so when I'm doing my video on Wednesday or whatnot that sort of does a similar thing to Bison but using Photoshop and image sampling, maybe I'll add in a little tutorial on how to do steps as well based on this landscape, but there's just not enough time for it today. So does anyone have any questions about this? Oh, yeah, Jeremy, you could use a color swatch. I find sometimes that it doesn't show shadows very well, so maybe it's just my display settings. But yeah. So does anyone have any questions about this kind of methodology? I think what I'd do if I had ends like this, where you know I just have these open ends. Essentially, what I might do is I'd just go View, Shaded. I would extrude, I would just, actually I'd probably go Curve from Objects. I'd go Duplicate Face Border for the site, and I'd just extrude it up, like so. And then from there, what I might do is I'd grab the edges of this mesh by going into Grasshopper, quickly referencing the mesh. I would go Mesh, Analysis, Mesh Edges, grab the naked edges, go Curve, Utilities, Join Curves. I would bake those mesh edges, and then I would take the mesh edges that I just baked, so like this right here, and I would trim away the top part of this surface to create this wall. If I want to create, like, let's say a fence around this, so, you know, visitors to this site didn't drop off the edge, I would just maybe, you know, extrude it like 3.5 feet or whatever. You know, so you could start making a fence from there. So there's your fence around the site. So any other questions? Okay, well, if no one has any kind of general questions, that is the class over. If anyone has some particular questions about their own work, feel free to ask me. I'll stick around for a couple minutes. But again, have a good Canada Day. So we don't have class on Wednesday. But next week we will go into sort of the final portion of massing. So you'll be able to take all your site development techniques, as well as, you know, the massing techniques we've developed so far, plus one more technique that we'll develop in the next class, and you'll sort of be able to create a site-informed massing in an interesting site. So thank you so much, and I will see you next week. Feel free to email me or Nicholas if you have any questions. So thank you.